Welcome back. This unit is all about arrays. And in this video, we're going to be talking about arrays as parameters. We've actually already seen that, so we'll breeze right through that. But we'll get started on coding something that I call ArrayHelper. And that is going to ultimately look at a lot of common array algorithms. Like all other objects, an array can be specified as a parameter in a method definition or passed in as an argument in a method call. We actually saw this when we're looking at some coding bats in previous videos. Here, I have an array called values. It's an integer array, right? That is the data type of the variable. That is the data type of my parameter. This means we can pass in integer arrays to this method. Inside the method, we'll be able to access and edit the elements within the array itself. In this example, the name of the array is values. In order to access an element in the array, use the square bracket notation, blah, 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 blah. We've done that. I would like to take this opportunity to code display, and this is going to go in ArrayHelper. This is a class that we're making. Take a look at this method signature. The name of the method is display. This is in a class called ArrayHelper. It's going to take in an integer array as a parameter or argument. It is not going to return anything, and the underline indicates that it is static. Write a method that prints each element of the array on the same line separated by commas. If you'll recall, printing an array is a bit of a problem. Whenever we try to print an array, that is, we take the variable and put it into an SOP, what we actually get is the reference, the memory reference, the pointer. It's not very useful. In order to see the contents, what we did when we first got introduced to an array is that we actually looped through and printed off the elements. I effectively want to take that and put it into a method that will allow us to quickly see the contents of the array. I've already got IntelliJ up. I'm going to make a new project by going to File, New Project. I'm going to go Next, Next. And I'm already in my Principles folder. So I'm going to create ArrayHelper. Okay. The idea behind ArrayHelper is that arrays don't actually have methods. Like, pretty much literal none. I'm going to say none. It's technically some, but I'm going to say none. Arrays don't have methods. So we're going to write a class that will basically bring in some methods, some commands to simplify our task. For instance, quickly seeing the contents of the array. So here I am in IntelliJ. I've right-clicked on the SRC. I'll make a new class that I'm calling ArrayHelper. Okay. I'm not going to plug in a main method. I'll talk about why in just a moment. But I am going to go ahead and turn this method signature into a method header. All right, we're inside the ArrayHelper class. The name of the method is display, blah, 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 blah. So I'm going to go public, static, right? The underline indicates that it is static. The return type here is void. The name of the method is display. And we're going to take in an integer array, which I call nums. You can kind of call it whatever you want to here. I'm a big fan of nums. So this is our signature, right? Public static void display integer array nums. The idea here is that we want to print each element of the array on the same line separated by commas. And we have this really good example here. I'm going to go ahead and put a comment above my method header that kind of describes what this method does. This prints each element of the array. How about this? Prints the contents of nums. I can say nums because I see it right here. Prints the contents of nums. Kind of period. Maybe we would say an example, right? 2, 7, 9, 4. What I'm noting here is that I do want the brackets to be part of it, and I do want the comma and the spaces to separate our elements. Okay. So what we want to do is loop through this array. I'm going to plug in a for loop. For loops we're going to find go really hand in hand with arrays. And here I use the IntelliJ shortcut syntax for I. It's giving me the opportunity to rename my counter variable. I like I, so I'm going to leave that alone. I am going to, however, hit tab, which will put me here at the condition. We'll say as long as I is less than nums.length, right? Notice we're saying less than nums.length, which means we won't have an iteration whenever I is exactly nums.length. We actually stop whenever I hits nums.length, and that's good because if I tried to access an element at nums.length, I would go out of bounds. Our first index in our array, however, is 0, so this just makes perfect sense, right? So what I want to do with each iteration is effectively print the current element along with a comma in space. You'll notice I need to do this bracket. We can go ahead and do that. It happens one time, no matter how long the array is, which indicates to me it needs to be done outside the loop. I'm going to do an S out to quickly get my syntax here, my SOP, but I'm going to take away the LN. The reason being, I want to print the bracket, and the next thing I print, which in theory is the first element of the array, I want it to appear on the same line. If I did an LN, it would do bracket and then a new line. So anything that appears after that would be on a separate line. So we're just going to print the bracket for now. Okay, cool. Now we're at our loop. I've done the bracket. I'm ready to print off the current element. Okay, when I say current element, I'm talking about using this counter variable as our index. And we're going to go inside of our array. Right? Nums at I is what I would call the current element. Nums is an integer array. Nums at I is a single integer, an element. In this context, we would say that I is an index. Okay, so that is the element, and I want to print it. So I'm going to put that inside of an SOP. Again, if I were to print the current element using a print line, I would print the element and then create a new line. So anything that comes after the fact would be on a new line. I don't quite want that, so I'm going to get rid of the ln. Whenever I print the current element for each of these, notice that I have a comma in space. So let's go ahead and tack that on. There's going to be some issues with this here towards the end, and we'll talk about how to deal with those. After I'm done printing everything in the array, I want the closing bracket, which is effectively the same thing here. Again, it only happens once, no matter how long the array is. So I'm going to do it one time, meaning not inside of a loop. With this one, it is the end of the contents, which means that I am okay doing a print line here. The reason being is after I print off my array, I'm okay with whatever comes next to be on a new line. Okay, let's try this out. This is the bulk of it. I'm going to do something a little bit different. Historically, what we would do is plug in a main method here and do our testing here. I don't want to do that. What I want to do is give you a class that is reusable. The idea is that you could basically copy and paste this thing into your other projects, and you would have access to it. In practice, what we tend to do is kind of separate the class that does all of the execution from the class that has all the definitions, the method definitions. You've actually kind of experienced this in practice, right? We've been using strings, for instance. We've been using the math class. Those are classes that have been pre-written. They exist somewhere else. You're not writing main methods in the string class. You're not writing a main method in the math class. It exists. You have access to it. It's going to be something similar here. I'm going to right click on the SRC and make a new Java class, which I'm going to call driver. Okay. Driver, runner, these are words to describe a class that is designed to actually execute the program. In my driver class is where I'm going to plug in my PSVM, my main method. Okay. Because these two things are in the same folder, they'll be able to see each other, meaning driver can actually see ArrayHelper. How is that useful to us? Well, we're going to end up calling this display method. Before I do that, I'm going to need an integer array. So let's create an integer array. I'm going to call it something other than nums. It doesn't matter what you call it. You could call it nums, but I'm trying to kind of show you that just because it's called nums here doesn't mean it has to be called nums somewhere else. How about a classic? Numbears. I'm going to throw in some integers. 4, 2, -1, 3. They don't have to be single digits. So how about 33 instead? 96 and a 4 and a 20. Cool. I got some negative numbers. I got some double digits. It could be any value of an integer, so we can go really big with this. But I'm using an initializer list to quickly assign values to numbears. Now I want to test my display method. In essence, I'm calling display. Notice IntelliJ's mad at me. That's because if I did this, we would be looking for a display in this class. It's not here. It's in a different location, right? It's an ArrayHelper, and the method is static. So the way that I'm going to call it is by saying ArrayHelper, the class that it's defined in, dot display. You'll notice that IntelliJ has some IntelliSense. That is a universal term, right? When I do ArrayHelper dot, it's going to show me the things that ArrayHelper can do. Right now, it's just display. Display is going to take in an integer array. I've got one right here. I'm going to pass in numbears. Okay. I'm going to try this out, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. I'm going to right-click in free space and tell it to run since this is the first time. And there's what we got so far. There's the comma and space that I warned you about. But this syntax is similar to what you've done before. It's kind of the same. We've called methods out of math, right? Math.max. This is a static method coming out of the math class. This is a static method coming out of the ArrayHelper class. That's it. Okay, this takes in 2 integers. This one takes in an integer array. So there's a little bit difference in the parameters, but the syntax, the logic here is basically the same. Now let's talk about this extra comma and space. First of all, why does it appear? Because every time I print an element, now I'm printing a comma and space along with it. So that works for all of our other elements except the last one. There are 2 ways, 2 approaches to handle this. And this goes for a lot of computer science problems, really, a lot of logic. There is a prevention way, which says we won't allow this to happen to begin with. There is also a rollback way, which is we'll let it happen and then we'll roll it back. Both approaches have their merits. Since I'm doing this in a print, there's really no way to roll back in this particular case. Once I print it, it's there. So the only thing we can do is prevent it. Now, there's 2 ways to kind of prevent it here, at least 2 ways that I could think of that are super easy. One is to put an if statement here, right? If we're at the last element, I'm going to print something else. Okay. How do I know that we're at the last element? Well, if you can kind of just watch for a moment. If you're following along typing, trying to keep up with me, just watch for a moment because I'm going to undo this one and show you a better approach. If I is equal to nums.length minus 1, the last element occurs at this index. I logically, in this context, is an index. So I'm saying when the current index is equal to the last one, instead of doing this, printing the element with a comma and space, I'm just going to print the element. That is nums at I. Again, I would want that to be a print and not a print line. Otherwise, I'm going to print the current element along with a comma and space. Let's try that out. And you see that is beautiful. There's the contents of our array whenever we call the display method. Now, this is ultimately inefficient. The reason being is this if statement is checked every single time. It is only relevant on the last iteration, yet I check it for every element. It's not super taxing in terms of processing, but it is extra processing. I don't have to do that. So here's what I actually recommend. I'm going to back this up. Literally Control Z here. Think about something else that controls our loop. What if I just stopped one element early? Meaning I'm going to do this for all except the last element. Okay, if I were to run this right now, you would see everything but the 20 along with our common space, and we still end up with our bracket because it's happening here. What it means is once I reach this point, I've processed everything but the last element. So let's just print that by itself. That's only going to happen one time, right? So I'm going to do an S out, printing the last element from nums. That occurs at nums.length -1. Here, I'm just printing the element, not the common space. That was the whole objective, was to not get that extra common space. Print instead of a print line. And that does illustrate the problem I was talking about. If you do a print line, it's going to create a new line, so the thing that follows after appears on a new line. And there we have it. Okay. This does make one assumption. One thing that would break our program. Let me show you. You ready? I've commented this one out, so I'm not using it, but I have made numbers, and I've given it a length of 0. Okay, notice I can do this. IntelliJ's not mad. We get an index out of bounds. Notice it says array index out of bounds because we're ultimately going to go out of bounds in our array. And we get a -1. Now, IntelliJ, being the industrial level program that it is, will actually tell me where. This is a link, right? Notice when I hover over it, I can click this. It takes me directly to the point where I'm going out of bounds. This line in particular is going out of bounds. Why? Well, whenever I passed in numbers here with a length of 0, there's nothing in it. It comes in, we print off the bracket. Okay, the bracket actually did get printed, by the way, it's right there. I then create I, it's 0. We're going to say as long as I, which is 0, is less than nums.length -1. Well, when there's nothing in nums, it has a length of 0. So this is a -1. I'm asking, is 0 less than -1? No, this is false right away. So this isn't going to give me an issue. We'll skip right over this. I never even execute the loop. The condition was false immediately. When I get here, we're trying to access an element from nums at 0, -1, or -1. That is my -1 out of bounds right there. Okay, so there's a bit of a little hiccup here. We could just assume that we're not going to feed it anything with a 0. A really quick fix. Oh, I've never done this. I've never done this with this class, but I'm going to show it to you. At the very beginning, I'm going to say if nums.length is less than 1, or you can say equal to 0. If there's nothing in it, I'm going to return nothing. This is cheeky. This seems a little bit odd. I have a void return type, which says I can't return anything. Well, I'm not returning anything. But what is cool about this approach is that whenever I hit the return statement, we're going to peace out. We'll exit the method. I'm going to prove this works just by executing the program. Notice that my syntax error goes away. You could, in theory, if you want to do like some error checking, do like a little print here saying that, it doesn't have anything there. But this is one way to handle this very fringe scenario. I mean, the chances of us actually giving this thing an array with a length of 0 is very minor, very small, but it could happen. I'm going to bring back in numbers, and then we're going to take a look at our next method. So here is kind of the stuff that I recommend there in our slides. Oh, it looks like I coupled those last two things together. Right? Ultimately, at the end, we're printing one time. You could turn this into a print line, print the last element along with the ending bracket, which will allow you to get rid of this SOP. So we're doing both, the last element and the ending bracket in one SOP. I'm going to hit run again so that we can see that it does work. Good thinking, past me. All right, let's take a look at our next method we're going to write. This one's called fill. This is in the ArrayHelper class. The method is fill. We're taking in two parameters, an integer array as well as a single integer. Our return type is still void, and the underline indicates it's static. Write a method fill that replaces every element in the specified integer array with the one here. So whatever is in the array, I'm going to put this there instead. Oh, no, that was code. I was hoping we had an example. I'm back in my ArrayHelper class. I'm going to write a new method. Notice I'm in the body of the class. I'm not inside a display. Methods go, method definitions go inside of the body of the class. We're saying public static void, right? The underline, the void. The name of this method is fill. It takes in an integer array. I'll call that nums. It takes in an integer. I'll call that x. This method replaces every element in nums with x. Okay, so we practice accessing elements using a loop. Fill will have us kind of modify elements of the array using a loop. This one's quick. I'm going to create a for loop using my for I shortcut syntax. We'll say as long as I is less than nums.length. Again, this could be called something else. With each iteration, I want to update the current element being nums at I. I want this thing to become x. That's it. Right? We loop through. What is this warning? Just curious. So we're looping through, replacing every element with x. And to test this out, I'm going to flip back to my driver. We have our starter array. We're going to see the original contents. I'm now going to call ArrayHelper. When I hit this dot, the IntelliSense says, here's what you can call. Notice that fill is listed here. It takes an integer array. It takes an integer. I want to fill numbers. That is the integer array here in this scope. I'm going to fill it with, I don't know, 7. All right, I'm going to tell this thing to run. What's going on here? Did this work? It does work. This is modifying numbers. It is replacing every element with a 7. I just didn't print it, right? We're just following the code here. I create an array. I give it some values. I print it off to see what those values are. I then fill it with 7s, which does do something. I'm just not seeing the array again, right? So I can very quickly just call ArrayHelper.display again on numbers, and we can see that change, right? So I'm going to see it beforehand, which should have all of these elements. I'm going to fill it, and then I'll print it after that fill takes effect. And so it should be filled with 7s. And you see that each element is in fact a 7. Not too shabby, but we're using that square bracket syntax in order to change the elements. Contains. This is an ArrayHelper. Takes in an integer array as well as an integer. This one's giving us back a boolean. Contains should return true if the specified int can be found in our integer array. False otherwise. Okay, so I'm going to loop through this integer array looking for this integer. If I find it, we return true. If I manage to not find it, we return false. I'm back in ArrayHelper. we're going to go public static boolean contains. This takes in an integer array. I'll call that nums. And an int that I'm looking for, I'll call that x. This method returns true if x can be found in nums, false otherwise. I'm going to make this a lowercase r if I'm doing everything else lowercase. You know what? Everything's uppercase. All right. So I'm going to loop through. With each iteration, I'm going to ask, is the current element x? Is the current element x? Is the current element x? As we go. If that is ever true, I can stop searching because I found it. If we manage to go through the entire array and that I'm just through the entire array, I've exhausted my search, then it must not be there. I'm going to start looping. I'll say as long as I is less than nums.length. With each iteration, I'm going to ask, is the current element nums.I the one that I'm looking for? Okay, be careful here. I would not be surprised if some students tried to do nums at x. This is kind of misusing x. If I did this, this is assuming that x is an index. X is not an index. X is effectively an element, right? I am comparing element to element. Nums is an integer array. Nums at I is a single integer. In this context, I is an index, X is an element. Okay. If this is true, that means I found what I'm looking for. I can stop searching. I'm going to return true. Not only is this giving me an affirmative that yes, we did find it, but the return statement is going to piece out of the method, right? I stopped searching in that moment. Notice that IntelliJ is mad at me, right? Because it's saying missing return statement. It is possible, right, that this never actually gets executed. It's possible that this is just always false. It's possible that this is false right away. And so we never reach this return statement. I need to return something outside the loop. And that is our false case. If I make it to this point, that means I went through the entire array and this never happened. This was always false, meaning that our element's not there. If I manage to search the entire array, that means that the element that we're looking for, x, it's not there. So I can return false down here. Let's try it out. Okay. I'm going to maybe put some spaces between these things. I am now ready for ArrayHelper.contains. I'm going to look through numbers for a 7. Now, keep in mind, we just filled it. It's nothing but 7s at this point. This should be true. Where's my true value? This is returning a true value. It's just sitting here. I'm not doing anything with it. I'm not saving it into a variable. I'm not printing it. It's just hanging out here, right? Display was a little bit different because it did the printing itself. Fill doesn't return anything. It just performs an action and has a void return type. So we didn't need to print anything there. This one, however, is returning a true or false value. If I want to see that, I'm going to have to print it. So I'm going to do an S out on what's returned. So notice that this is inside of my S out. We could save it into a variable. Maybe I'll demonstrate what that looks like. But there's a true value just sitting here, which is what I will print. And we see that there. Okay, let's look for something that's not an array. Keep in mind, it is full of 7s. I get a false value. Okay, what if I comment this out, which means the fill never happens. So whenever we reach this point, it's the original array. I print off numbers. That's what we see here. I never fill it. We print it off again for good measure. And there it is there. I am looking for a 4 inside of that array. True, it's there. What about like a -1? That's true. What about a 7? That's false. Okay. All right, let's think about this for a moment. I'm going to say that we're searching for a -1. So let's say that we're calling contains and we're passing in. Let's make this a little bit smaller. We're passing in this array and we're looking for a -1, right? In order to call contains, I need an array. I need, what are we looking for? So following the logic, let's do some tracing here. I is effectively here. I get the current element, it's a 4. I'm going to ask, is 4 equal to -1? This is false, so we'd skip this. We do an I++. We're now here. We would ask, is I less than our length? It is. Is the current element equal to the -1 that I'm looking for? That's false. So I'd skip over this. We do an I++. We're now here. I'm going to ask, is I less than our length? It is. Is the current element, -1, equal to the -1 that I'm looking for? It is. So we would enter the body of this if statement where we're going to return true. We'd piece out of the method, returning a true value to this point, and then that's what gets printed. What if I had that exact same array, but we're looking for a 7? I create I. It's at index 0. I'll ask, is it less than our length? It is. Is the current element of 4 equal to the one that I'm looking for? That's false. We'd skip this. We do an I++. We'd ask, is I less than our length? It is. Is the current element equal to the one that I'm looking for? That's false. We'd skip this. We do an I++. We'd ask, are we less than our length? We are. Is the current element, a -1, equal to the 7 that I'm looking for? No, we'd skip this. We do an I++. Are we less than our length? Yes. Is the current element, a 33, equal to the 7 that I'm looking for? Nope, we'd skip that. We do an I++. We would ask, is I less than our length? No. At which point we would exit the loop. The only thing left to do is return false. And so that's how we hit our false value whenever that happens. Okay. I thought I had something to add. Not really. I haven't been taking the braces off these things, but you can. This for loop technically has one statement in it, an if statement. Even though you see 2 lines, there's only one statement, an if statement. Up here, we definitely only got one statement. You could get rid of these braces. And then here, one statement. You can get rid of these braces. Okay. I feel like that's probably a good spot to stop. We coded 3 methods in our ArrayHelper class. I'll see you in the next one.